"I'm too broken to birth your child," cried the obese virgin, but the mountain man made her pregnant. They lined the charity bread queue like fence posts under a gray Montana sky, whispering the kind of pity that bruises deeper than fists. Charity Whitmore kept her head down, coat too thin, hands chafed red from winter work at the poorhouse. When Sister Margaret slipped a loaf into her basket, a rancher's wife hissed to a friend, "She's the one the doctor said can't give a man an heir. Broken goods." The whisper traveled faster than the wind. Charity's cheeks burned. She had learned to breathe around shame, the way you breathe around a cracked rib, carefully, shallowly, pretending it doesn't hurt. Behind her, the stagecoach rattled in, throwing up a cold mist of slush. A rider loomed from its wake, broad as a barn door, hat snow-dusted, a scar bending from shoulder to breastbone beneath a worn buffalo coat. Jeremiah Blackwood swung down with a hunter's ease and a mourner's quiet. Folks called him a mountain man, the kind that lived where maps ran out, the kind that carried winter inside his bones. He handed the sisters a wrapped haunch of venison, a roll of well-cured hides, and a pouch that clinked. "For the infirmary," he said, voice low, rough-hewn like a log cut true. He turned and saw Charity. For a breath, the square went still. Her blue eyes met his gray ones, a startled deer meeting the mountain itself. Someone snickered. "Don't waste your gaze, Mr. Blackwood. That girl's too broken to birth you anything." The words slapped the air. Charity found her voice, small and steady. "I am not a cradle," she said. "I am a person." The laughter died, uneasy. Jeremiah tipped his hat to her, a gesture plain as daylight, and faced the gossiping knot of mouths. "A whole woman," he said, "weighs more than a womb." Sister Margaret cleared her throat, half warning, half blessing. Snow began to fall, soft, relentless, erasing footprints and foolishness together. If you're listening from Boston or Berlin or a bunkhouse somewhere between, tell me, where in the world are you hearing this? And would you have spoken up for Charity right there in the street? Charity Whitmore had once believed her life would follow the same rhythm as her mother's. Marriage by 20, a home full of laughter, children crowding her skirts. But that belief had burned away 5 years ago in an alley of Philadelphia, replaced by silence, by shame, by a diagnosis that turned her body into a sentence. You may never bear a child. Her father, unable to bear the whispers, had sent her west under the guise of charitable work. The sisters of Meadowbrook's poorhouse had taken her in, and she had stayed because nowhere else felt safe. She rose before dawn, scrubbed laundry until her fingers bled, tended the sick, and prayed the same quiet prayer every night, that God would make her useful, even if he would never make her whole again. She told herself she was content, that the ache in her chest was something like peace, until Jeremiah Blackwood began to appear at the gates every few weeks, first with donations, then with excuses to linger. The townsfolk spoke of him in half-myths. Some said he'd once wrestled a mountain lion bare-handed. Others swore he'd killed a man and gone to ground in the high country. The truth was simpler and sadder. 15 years ago, his wife and sons had perished in a forest fire while he was hunting. By the time he returned, the cabin was ash. He'd buried what was left with his own hands and never lived among people again. He built a new cabin high on Silver Ridge, trapping furs and trading them twice a year. His silence had become legend, his solitude a warning. But when Sister Margaret had nursed him after a hunting injury years earlier, he'd found a sliver of gratitude for humankind again, and promised to repay it each winter with supplies. Charity noticed how he carried himself, shoulders slightly bowed as if the air itself were heavy, how he spoke sparingly, but with gentleness when he did. He noticed how she moved around the infirmary, careful, quiet, but never cold. How she smiled at children, even the ones that reminded her of what she thought she'd lost forever. Yet the world of Meadowbrook was small and cruel in its judgments. When Jeremiah lingered too long by the fence to speak with her, the matrons gossiped. When he left a small bag of coffee beans on the step for her to warm your mornings, the blacksmith's wife muttered that a woman like Charity should know her place. Sister Margaret, wise and weathered, saw what neither of them dared to name. "Charity," she said one evening as they folded bandages by lamplight, "not every miracle comes wrapped in angels' wings. Sometimes it comes wearing scars." Charity blushed, almost angry. He deserved someone better, someone whole. Sister Margaret's hands kept moving. "Child, none of us are whole. The trick is finding someone whose cracks fit yours." Later that night, Jeremiah came again, bringing candles and flour. Snow fell thick around him, clinging to his beard, making him look like some lost patriarch of winter. Charity met him at the door, and for the first time, she didn't lower her eyes. "Thank you," she said softly. He shrugged. "The ridge gives what I don't need. You make use of it. Seems fair." "Still," she said, voice trembling, "you didn't have to." He looked at her then, really looked, and said, "Maybe I did." Behind them, the wind howled through the trees, carrying the smell of pine and something older, something like the beginning of a story neither of them yet understood. Winter in Montana is a test of everything: muscle, faith, and the fragile threads that tie one heart to another. By January, the snow lay deep enough to swallow a horse's legs, and the road from Silver Ridge to Meadowbrook vanished under drifts so high they silenced the world. Still, Jeremiah Blackwood came. Sometimes he arrived with bundles of meat or pelts, sometimes with nothing at all except a quiet need to see her. Charity stopped pretending she didn't wait for him. She found herself looking up at the ridgeline each afternoon, listening for the soft thunder of his boots outside the gate. One evening he came limping through the snow, his sleeve dark with blood. Charity gasped and pulled him inside before he could protest. "It's nothing," he grunted. "Bear trap sprung wrong." "You'll sit down now," she said, voice trembling but firm. She washed the wound, her hand steady, her breath uneven. His skin was hot beneath her touch, marked by the wild, scars old and new, the history of a man who'd lived closer to beasts than men. He watched her as she worked, her brow furrowed, lips pressed tight in concentration. When she finished, she said quietly, "You shouldn't have come through the storm." His eyes softened. "Wasn't the storm that brought me?" She looked away, cheeks burning. "Then what was it?" "You," he said simply. The words hung between them, fragile as frost. Charity wanted to speak, but her voice caught somewhere between disbelief and longing. For days after, he stayed at the infirmary to heal. He helped chop wood, fix the roof, mend fences. The sisters watched from the windows, whispering with smiles that Charity pretended not to see. At night, when the others slept, she sat by the fire reading scripture aloud to him. He listened, his rough hands folded on his knees, the orange light painting his scarred face gold. Once, when she stumbled over a passage about faith restoring the broken, he said softly. Maybe it's not faith that heals people. Maybe it's being seen. Her eyes glistened. Do you see me, Jeremiah? He hesitated. Aye, and every time I do it hurts a little less to be alive. She wanted to tell him she felt the same, that his presence mended something inside her she thought long dead. But fear was a stubborn habit. Then, one bitter night, a telegram arrived. It was from a trader on the ridge. An avalanche had crushed several cabins. Jeremiah's trapline cabin among them. He didn't curse, didn't flinch, just stood still staring at the paper. That's everything I built, he murmured. Charity touched his arm. Then build again. Here. He turned to her, bewildered. You'd have me stay? I'd have you live, she said. So he stayed. The days passed in rhythm, chopping wood, tending fires, fixing what others had abandoned. Charity grew stronger beside him, laughing more, walking taller. He showed her how to track rabbits in snow, how to tell when the wind would turn, how to listen for the hush before a storm. One evening, they stood outside watching the northern lights shimmer above the valley. Charity whispered, Do you ever wonder why God kept us alive when He took so much? Jeremiah's answer was slow. Maybe so we could find what was left worth saving. She looked up at him, the lights dancing in her eyes. For the first time, she reached for his hand, her small fingers disappearing in his. He didn't move away. The wind rose, but neither of them felt the cold. That night, when he walked her back to the door, she said in a trembling voice, Good night, Jeremiah. He tipped his hat, eyes warm with something that frightened and comforted her all at once. Good night, Charity. But when she closed the door, she leaned against it and whispered into the dark, Don't go too far. And somehow she knew he wouldn't. By early spring, the sisters' infirmary no longer needed Jeremiah's steady hands every day. The snow began to soften into mud, rivers cracked their frozen shells, and life crept back into the valley. That was when Jeremiah asked the question that had been living quietly behind his eyes for months. Come up the ridge with me, he said, voice rougher than usual, like gravel under a slow wheel. The old cabin's gone, but I've started rebuilding. There's room for another pair of hands and another heart. Charity's breath caught. Jeremiah, people will talk. He gave a dry smile. They already do. Sister Margaret, hearing their conversation, placed a gentle hand on Charity's shoulder. Child, the Lord sends us where we're needed. Maybe He's sending you to the mountains. And so she went. The journey up Silver Ridge took an entire day. Jeremiah led the way, his pack heavy with supplies. Charity followed on the mule he'd brought for her, wrapped in furs, her cheeks flushed from cold and wonder. The world grew wilder with every mile, pine forests rising like cathedrals, the air sharp with snowmelt and cedar. When they reached the cabin site, Charity stared in awe. It wasn't much yet, just a single-room shelter with smoke curling from a new chimney, but it stood solid and warm against the backdrop of endless peaks. It's beautiful, she whispered. He nodded toward the mountains. Out here, nothing asks who you used to be, only who you are today. Over the next weeks, their lives fell into a rhythm that felt both ancient and new. Mornings began with the hiss of the kettle and the creak of wood under his boots. Charity baked bread in a small iron stove, humming softly, while Jeremiah worked outside splitting logs or repairing snares. The smell of smoke and flour and pine filled the air. Simple things, but to them they smelled like belonging. He taught her how to mend a boot, how to recognize safe herbs from poison, how to listen to the silence of the forest. She, in turn, taught him gentleness again, how to speak kindly to a wounded bird before setting it free, how to laugh without fear of the echo. Some evenings they sat before the fire. Charity would sew or read aloud from the small Bible she'd brought, and Jeremiah would whittle shapes from wood, tiny animals, a cradle no bigger than a teacup. One night she noticed him carving again, his brow furrowed. "What is it this time?" she asked, smiling. He hesitated, then showed her. It was a small wooden woman with round cheeks and folded hands. Her. Her throat tightened. "Why would you make me?" He looked at her steadily. "Because you make this place feel alive." She had no answer to that. As days stretched into months, the cabin filled with laughter that had been buried too long. They shared meals, work, silences. When she burned the bread, he pretended to like it anyway. When he overcut the firewood, she teased that he was trying to fight the trees themselves. But beneath the gentle rhythm, something deeper stirred, a love too fragile to name. One evening, as rain pattered softly on the roof, Charity sat beside the fire, mending his torn shirt. Her fingers brushed the fabric over the scar near his heart, and she asked quietly, "Does it still hurt?" He looked down at her hand. "Some nights, less when you're here." She smiled faintly, but her voice trembled. "I'm still afraid, Jeremiah, afraid of what I can't give." He reached over, tilting her chin toward him. "You've already given me more than I thought I'd ever have again." Tears welled in her eyes. "I'm too broken for a family?" His answer was a whisper. "Then I'll be your family." That night, when she fell asleep by the fire, he pulled a blanket over her shoulders, watching the flicker of warmth return to her face. Outside, the mountains groaned under melting snow, and for the first time in 15 years, Jeremiah Blackwood prayed, not for forgiveness, but for time. Weeks later, when wildflowers began to break through the thaw, Charity stood outside, the wind tangling her hair, the scent of earth and pine filling the air. Jeremiah came up behind her, placing a hand on her shoulder. "Look," he said softly, pointing toward the valley below. "Everything that died last winter comes back when the sun's ready." She turned, eyes shining. "Do you think people can, too?" He met her gaze. "I think you just did." By midsummer, Silver Ridge had turned gold. The meadows shimmered with tall grass, the air warm enough for bare arms and laughter that rolled across the valley. For the first time in years, Charity felt free of the gray weight that had followed her everywhere. The past felt far away until it came back, wearing a stranger's face. It was late afternoon when she saw the dust cloud rising from the trail. Jeremiah was away hunting. Charity shaded her eyes, expecting a trader or prospector. Instead, a man on horseback approached, thin, sharp-eyed, dressed like the city, not the frontier. He reined in his horse and called, "Miss Charity Whitmore?" Her heart clenched. No one had used her full name in years. "Yes," she said cautiously. He dismounted and removed his hat. "Samuel Crane. I represent the Whitmore family estate in Philadelphia. Your father passed last winter." Charity froze. The name was a wound reopened. "My father, he sent me away." The man nodded stiffly. "And in his final will, he named you heir to the remaining property if you return and reclaim it." Charity shook her head. "That life is over. I belong here." Crane studied the cabin behind her, the rough logs, the drying herbs, the scent of wood smoke. Here, with a trapper who lives like a beast? Miss Whitmore, you could live in comfort again. Her pulse pounded. Mr. Blackwood is more of a man than anyone in that city ever was. The lawyer sneered. So it's true? You've taken up with him? Does he know what you are? What happened to you in Philadelphia? The papers said, Enough! Her voice cut through the air like a whip. You will not say another word. At that moment, the forest answered with a low growl of thunder, not from the sky, but from the man stepping out of the trees, Jeremiah. He looked every bit the legend they whispered about, taller than the doorway, hair wild from the wind, rifle slung across his back. His eyes went cold the moment they met Crane's. You've said enough to her, he rumbled. Now say your piece to me. Crane faltered but straightened. Mr. Blackwood, I meant no disrespect. I came to deliver a legal matter. Miss Whitmore's inheritance is waiting in Philadelphia. She doesn't need your money. Crane's jaw tightened. She could have a life beyond this wilderness. Jeremiah took a step closer, and Crane's horse stamped nervously. You call this wilderness. I call it peace. You tell her she's broken. I call her whole. Charity touched Jeremiah's arm, trying to calm him, but his voice was steady, carved from stone. You can take your message and go. She's not returning. Crane looked at Charity one last time, pity and disdain mingling in his eyes. You'll regret this, Miss Whitmore. You can't run from who you were. When he rode off down the trail, silence fell heavy as dusk. Charity turned away, trembling. He knows everything. He'll tell people. Jeremiah's hand found hers. Let them talk. They can't touch you here. But the things he said about me, about being ruined, he gripped her shoulders gently. You are not what happened to you. You are what you've survived. Her tears spilled then, hot and furious. I hate that he can still make me feel small. Jeremiah brushed them away with a thumb roughened by years of labor. Then stand taller. Let me remind you how. That night, the storm finally broke. Rain hammered the roof, wind howled through the pines. Inside the cabin, Charity stood at the hearth, staring into the fire while Jeremiah set his rifle aside and crossed the room. Do you believe I see you, Charity? He asked quietly. She nodded, voice breaking. Yes. Then stop looking back. I'm right here. And for the first time, she believed it. Believed that love could be stronger than shame, that she could start over even after the world had called her unworthy. Outside, thunder rolled down the ridge. Inside, a new kind of silence bloomed, one that felt like promise. Autumn returned to Silver Ridge with copper leaves and the scent of rain-soaked pine. Charity and Jeremiah had built a life that seemed unshakable, until the past rode back one morning with more than words. Jeremiah had gone to trade pelts in Meadowbrook, leaving Charity alone in the cabin. She was kneading bread when the dogs began barking wild and sharp. Before she could reach the door, it flew open. Samuel Crane stood there again, but he wasn't alone. Behind him were two men in dusted coats, their eyes hard. Miss Whitmore, Crane said, rain dripping from his hat brim. I warned you this wilderness couldn't hide you. The Whitmore estate has debts, and by law its heir must return to settle them or forfeit all assets, including personal claim. Charity's heart pounded. I told you, I don't want it. He sneered. Then your silence is admission of abandonment. The property and your name will be sold to repay what your father owed. You'll be left with nothing, unless, he stepped closer, You come back and marry the man who's offered to absorb the debt." Her stomach twisted. "You mean marry for money?" Crane's smile was thin. "It's what ruined women do best." Before she could answer, a shadow filled the doorway. Jeremiah. He had returned sooner than expected, his coat dripping from the storm, rifle slung low. The look in his eyes could have split mountains. "Say that again," he growled. Crane stiffened. "This is legal business, Mr. Blackwood." Jeremiah stepped forward, each word like the strike of an axe. "You call her ruined. You call her property. Say it again, and I'll show you what men like you really earn." The two hired men reached for their guns, but Jeremiah was faster. In one motion, he swung the rifle up, not firing, only striking. The butt hit the first man square in the chest, sending him sprawling. The second froze under Jeremiah's stare, hands trembling. "Out," Jeremiah said, voice low. "All of you." Crane backed toward the door. "You're a fool, Blackwood. She's damaged goods, and you'll lose everything." Jeremiah moved so fast, Crane stumbled backward into the mud. "I already lost everything once. This time, I choose who's worth keeping." Rain poured down, cold and merciless. Crane fled down the trail, his men scrambling after him. Inside, Jeremiah set the rifle aside and turned to Charity. She stood frozen, trembling, not from fear, but from the weight of what had just happened. "You shouldn't have risked yourself for me," she whispered. He stepped closer. "You think I haven't risked worse? I'd fight every man between here and Philadelphia if it meant you never doubted who you are again." Her tears came then. Tears of fury, of love, of release. "Why do you keep choosing me?" He took her face in his hands. "Because you're the first thing I've ever wanted that wasn't born out of loss." Outside, thunder cracked once more across the ridge, but this time it sounded less like danger and more like a vow. The storm passed by morning, leaving the air clean and the sky a startling blue. The world felt washed new, as though Silver Ridge itself had been reborn. Charity stood outside the cabin, her hair loose, her hands wrapped around a mug of coffee Jeremiah had brewed strong and black. The wind tugged at her shawl. Down the slope, the valley gleamed with rainwater and sun, a mirror of everything they'd survived. Jeremiah came up behind her, silent as always, then rested a hand on her shoulder. "You're quiet," he said. She smiled faintly. "For the first time in years, I don't feel afraid." He studied her profile. "And if they come again?" "They won't," she said. Then, after a pause, "And even if they do, I'm not running any more." He nodded, pride softening the hard lines of his face. "Good. You were never meant to hide." Inside the cabin, the fire still burned. Its warmth filled the space between them. Two souls once cracked open by grief and shame, now mended by something stronger than either had thought possible. Charity set her cup down and turned to face him. "You said once that everything that dies in winter comes back when the sun's ready." He smiled, slow and tender. "Looks like you were right on time." She stepped closer, her voice barely a whisper. "No, Jeremiah, we were." He pulled her into his arms then, holding her as though anchoring her to the earth. For the first time, she didn't feel broken or undeserving. She felt whole, because someone had loved her exactly as she was. Outside, the river sang softly, carrying away the last echoes of their fear. Sometimes, healing doesn't come from medicine or time. It comes from being truly seen. Charity and Jeremiah's story reminds us that love can grow in the quietest places, between two people who stopped believing they were worthy of it. If you've ever felt broken, unwanted, or forgotten, remember this. You are not defined by what happened to you, but by how bravely you keep going. Some wounds turn into scars. Others bloom into strength. Tell me, where are you listening from tonight? And if you still believe that love can heal the impossible, stay. The next story is for you.